They said the northern woods belonged to no man, but that night, the forest chose her. A woman with no kingdom, no home, running from a crown she never wanted. The storm was closing in, snow swallowing the path behind her. Her breath came in clouds, her courage in fragments. And still, she didn't stop. Not until she reached the edge of the world, where silence had teeth, and even the wind whispered her name. Welcome back, Pack. If you've been following our stories, you already know, love and danger always hunt together here. And if you're new, hit that subscribe and stay close. You'll want to hear this one till the very end. Because tonight, mercy will test fate. And before the moon sets, a woman's kindness will awaken something ancient, something that doesn't forget a debt. Dawn came in fragments, a slow bleeding of light across the snow. The fire in Rowena's hearth had long died, leaving only the smell of smoke and cold ash. When she stepped outside, silence met her like a living thing. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that listens. Frost clung to her lashes. The forest stood in perfect stillness, every branch heavy with ice, every sound swallowed. Then, she saw them. Shadows shifting at the edge of the clearing. 1, then 2, then 20. Wolves, dozens of them, forming a wide, perfect circle around her cabin. Their eyes glowed like embers under the pale light, unblinking, united, patient. The pup she'd rescued limped forward, a streak of silver fur against the snow. It gave a small whine and pressed its nose to the air. No growl came from the others. No rush, no attack. Only silence. A silence so complete that Rowena could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. She took one trembling step backward, her hand brushing the doorframe. The pup stopped halfway, then turned toward the tree line. That's when she saw it. Out from between the pines, a shape emerged, larger than any wolf she had ever imagined. Its fur shimmered beneath the weak light, black as midnight, yet glinting with silver where frost had kissed it. Power moved in its stride, measured and absolute. The other wolves lowered their heads as it passed. The air changed, colder, heavier, as though the forest itself recognized its king. The beast stopped before her cabin. The distance between them was no more than 10 paces, yet the weight of its gaze pressed against her chest like a hand. Its eyes were unlike the others, deep gold, bright enough to catch the reflection of her breath. And for a fleeting moment, she swore the creature was studying her. As though deciding what she was worth, the rescued pup limped closer to the massive wolf, pressing its tiny head against the black fur. The alpha lowered its muzzle and brushed the pup's flank with deliberate gentleness. Then, astonishingly, it turned to Rowena, and bowed. Not a trick of movement. Not instinct. A gesture, deliberate, solemn. Every wolf followed suit, lowering their heads in perfect unison, the clearing filling with the sound of snow shifting beneath their paws. Rowena stood frozen, heart hammering in her chest, unsure whether to kneel or run. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the wolves began to move. They parted like a tide, forming a narrow path from the tree line to her doorstep. The alpha turned, vanishing briefly into the trees, only to return moments later with something dragging behind it, a deer, freshly taken, its weight carving a path through the snow. The creature laid it at her feet with a quiet thud, steam still rising from the wound. Rowena stared at the offering, speechless. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but she couldn't move. This wasn't prey. This was a gift. The alpha watched her reaction, its golden eyes unflinching. Then, with the same slow grace, it turned and slipped back into the forest. One by one, the others followed, vanishing into the shadows until only the silence remained. Rowena sank to her knees in the snow. She wanted to believe it was gratitude for saving the pup, but deep inside, she knew better. Gratitude doesn't bow, it claims. That night, the storm returned. Wind clawed at the cabin walls, whispering in the cracks between boards. Rowena sat beside the hearth, watching the flames die again and again, unable to sleep. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the same image, a sea of gold eyes watching her from the dark. She could feel their presence, not menacing, but expectant, as though waiting for her to speak a language she had forgotten. When she finally drifted into sleep, the dream came clear and sharp. She stood barefoot in the snow, the black wolf before her, moonlight glinting off its fur. But when it lifted its head, it wasn't a wolf at all, it was a man, tall, wild, his gaze burning with the same gold light. He spoke no words. He didn't need to. Because she already knew what he was trying to say. "You belong to me." Rowena woke gasping, her hand pressed to her throat, her pulse racing. The dream felt too real, the echo of those eyes still heavy in her chest. She rose, moving to the door with unsteady hands. The night was too still again. No wind, no sound. When she pulled the latch, the hinges groaned. Cold air rushed in. And with it, the scent of iron and snow. Her eyes widened, because standing where the offering had been was no beast, but a man, bare, wounded, breath steaming in the pale light. And when his gaze met hers, the world tilted. They were the same golden eyes that had haunted her dream. The snow outside her cabin was no longer untouched. Crimson streaks marked the path where the man had fallen, painting a trail across the clearing. Rowena hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then she ran to him. His body was half buried in the drift, skin pale against the frost, a pattern of claw marks carved across his chest and shoulder, deep, deliberate, too clean to be the work of any wild beast. His breath came shallow, uneven, every exhale forming a ghost in the cold air. She didn't know if he was human, or something else. But something in his stillness, something in the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, made her act before thought could stop her. Rowena took his arm, cold and heavy, and dragged him inside. The cabin door slammed shut against the wind, and silence wrapped around them both. She laid him near the hearth, feeding the fire with trembling hands until the flames caught and painted his wounds in trembling gold light. The marks across his chest were unlike any she'd ever seen, as if steel and claw had met flesh at once. His skin carried faint traces of dark fur around the edges of each cut, shimmering faintly before fading into nothing. She whispered to herself, half a prayer, half a plea, and tore a strip from her blanket to bind his shoulder. When her fingers brushed his skin, the heat startled her. It was like touching the surface of a forge. She pulled back instinctively, then steadied her breath. "You'll burn yourself to death before the night ends," she muttered, though he couldn't hear her. Still, she pressed the cloth against the wound. The moment she did, his eyes opened. Golden light met hers, the same eyes that had haunted her dream. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire cracked, wind whispered through the gaps in the walls, and his gaze stayed fixed on her face as if searching for something he had lost. He tried to speak. The sound came low, guttural, shaped like a growl before softening into a single word. Chorus. Rowena froze. What? She whispered. He repeated it, weaker this time. Chorus. Then slumped forward, unconscious once more. She watched his chest rise and fall, uncertain if she'd just heard a name, or a warning. When she finally let herself breathe, the realization struck her: she was no longer afraid. Only curious. The storm outside lasted through the night. Snow fell in heavy sheets, burying the world in white silence. Rowena stayed awake by the fire, watching over the stranger as he slept. Every few hours, his body would tense, his breathing change. Once, his hand reached for her wrist, not to hurt, but as if to make sure she was real. She noticed things she couldn't explain. The cuts she had cleaned no longer bled. The bruises beneath his ribs were fading before her eyes. His strength, unnatural as it seemed, was returning too fast. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, the storm had passed. She rose from the chair, stiff and half-numb, and turned to check on him one last time. The space beside the fire was empty. Only a few drops of water marked where he had been, leading to the door, and beyond it, into the snow. Rowena pushed the door open. The cold hit her like a blade, sharp and clean. The forest lay untouched, except for a single mark just outside the threshold. A print, large, deliberate, steaming faintly as though the snow itself refused to claim it. It wasn't human. The shape was unmistakable. A wolf's paw, far larger than any she'd ever seen. She knelt beside it, tracing the edges with shaking fingers. The snow hissed softly, melting where she touched it. Then she saw it, a faint shimmer rising from the print, like smoke catching the first light of dawn. She stepped back slowly, heart hammering in her chest. The man who had bled moonlight was gone. But something told her he hadn't gone far. The day passed in uneasy quiet. Rowena kept the door barred, though her eyes returned to the treeline again and again. Night fell early, swallowing the last of the light. She tried to sleep, but the forest had changed. The usual wind was gone. The wood creaked differently, like something heavy moved just beyond the walls. And then she heard it, a sound low and resonant, too close to mistake. A growl, not of threat, but of possession. It rattled the cabin walls and rolled through her bones like thunder. Rowena's breath caught. Her hand went to the latch, though she didn't know why. Outside, something moved, slow, deliberate, waiting. The forest had always whispered to Rowena. But that morning, it changed its voice. The birds were gone. The wind had stopped moving. Even the snow seemed to hold its breath. She stepped outside the cabin and felt it immediately, that old dread that once haunted her in marble halls, now wearing the scent of pine and iron. Something was coming. She turned toward the ridge and saw them. Crimson cloaks cutting through the white. 5 riders, their horses black against the snow, their armor catching what little sunlight escaped the clouds. Royal Guards. She didn't need to see the insignia to know whose men they were. The crown she had abandoned never stopped looking for what it owned. Rowena ducked back inside, heart pounding so hard she thought the noise alone would give her away. She pulled the curtains closed, pressed her palm to the wooden wall, and whispered, "Not again. Please, not again." Outside, voices rose, sharp, distant, commanding. The sound of boots crunching through snow moved closer with every word. "Tracks here," one of them shouted. "Small prints. She can't be far." Rowena crouched low, breath shallow. Her pulse drummed in her ears. She remembered the warnings whispered by the older servants before she fled the palace, that the king's hunters always returned with their prey. Always. Through a crack in the wall, she saw movement. A blade flashed in the pale light, the edge wet with frost. They were coming straight for her door. Her hand reached for the poker beside the hearth. Useless, but better than nothing. Then, the forest answered. A blur of motion tore through the tree line. The sound was unlike anything human, a deep, guttural roar that sent birds exploding into the air. The guards froze. One turned just in time to see the shape descend on him. Black fur, golden eyes, claws catching the light as easily as steel. The first man fell before he could scream. The second raised his sword. It snapped like glass under the beast's weight. Rowena couldn't look away. Snow turned red beneath the fury of something ancient, something that fought with both purpose and rage. The wolf was a shadow moving faster than thought, protector and monster woven into one. The air shook with growls, shouts, the clash of blades. Then, silence. Only one guard remained, the youngest. He stared at the creature, dropped his weapon, and ran. The wolf didn't chase him. It stood there, sides heaving, the snow around it steaming from heat and blood. And then it turned toward the cabin. Rowena stepped outside before she could think. The cold hit her like a warning. The great wolf staggered forward, eyes dimmer than before, every step heavier. "No, no, don't," she whispered, rushing to meet him. He collapsed just short of her feet, his body half buried in the snow. Silver light seeped through his fur, bright as molten metal, dripping from the open wounds. It wasn't blood, not exactly. It shimmered, alive, fading as it touched the ground. Rowena knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "You're hurt again. I told you," her voice broke. The creature's gaze lifted weakly to hers. For an instant, she thought he was smiling, if wolves could do such a thing. Then his body convulsed, shuddering under its own weight. Bones shifted, joints cracked, reshaping. The air around them rippled with heat as if the snow itself recoiled. Rowena stumbled backward, shielding her face from the light. When it faded, the wolf was gone. Where the beast had fallen now lay the man, the same stranger she had dragged in from the storm nights before. His breathing was shallow, his skin streaked with that same silver glow, fading fast. The forest, once alive with chaos, now stood utterly still. Not even the wind dared to move. Rowena knelt beside him again. Her fingers hovered over his face, unsure whether to touch or flee. The truth she had refused to believe was now undeniable. The man and the creature were one. She tore a strip from her cloak and pressed it against his shoulder, her movements mechanical, desperate. "Why?" she whispered. "Why protect me?" No answer came, only the faint rhythm of his breath, steady but weakening. She dragged him inside again. The same spot by the hearth, the same firelight painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. As she stoked the flames higher, his eyelids fluttered once, twice. Then they opened. The golden eyes she remembered were still there, but different now. Calmer, aware. They didn't belong to the beast anymore. They were looking at her. The storm had broken 3 days ago, yet snow still whispered across the clearing like ash from a long-quieted fire. Inside the cabin, warmth flickered weakly, a fragile flame struggling to live in a world made of frost. Rowena sat by the hearth, her palms cupped near the ember glow, watching it breathe against the dark. Across the room, the stranger lay on the cot she'd made from pine and wool. His wounds had closed, though the strange silver in his blood had left faint marks across his skin, a map of pain and survival. When he stirred, the floor creaked as though the cabin itself listened. She turned, her voice soft but steady. "Fire," she said, pointing to the glow. His eyes, gold with shadows moving inside them, followed her finger. "Fyr," he echoed, the sound foreign yet deliberate. Rowena smiled faintly. Close enough. The lessons had begun out of necessity. He needed words, she needed understanding. He learned fast, too fast sometimes. His gaze absorbed everything, the curve of her hand as she stirred the stew, the way she traced symbols into the wood, the quiet rhythm of her breath when she spoke. She found herself explaining things she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Home, hunger, mercy, warmth. Words that once belonged to her old life now lived here, reborn in his mouth. Outside, wolves howled across the ridge, not in warning, but as if calling to their lost leader. The sound trembled through the cabin's walls and into her bones. He looked toward the window, head tilted, listening as though the night itself were speaking his name. She whispered, "Do you understand them?" He did not answer. But the way his jaw tightened told her, yes. He understood every word they said. On the fifth night, the wind howled so fiercely that the door shuddered on its hinges. The hearth burned low, its flame shrinking into coals that glowed like trapped hearts. Rowena gathered dry bark and tinder, gesturing for him to come closer. "Watch," she said. She crouched beside the fire pit, striking flint against steel until sparks danced and died. He watched her hands with quiet intensity, his breath a faint mist in the chill air. When the sparks refused to catch, he reached out, large, rough fingers closing over hers. The gesture startled her. His skin was warm, almost fevered, yet steady, deliberate. He guided her movement once, twice, until the spark leapt, kissed the bark, and flame bloomed. A low sound escaped him, half wonder, half recognition. The firelight carved shadows across his face, revealing something ancient there, reverence. "Fyr," he murmured again. She nodded, whispering back, "Fire." Their hands remained close for a breath too long, both of them frozen in the glow. Then she pulled away, flustered by the quiet thunder of her heartbeat. Outside, snow fell in silence. Inside, the world felt small, just two souls and the fragile light between them. Days passed. The man's strength returned, and with it, fragments of memory. Words came haltingly at first. Water, sky, wolf. Each one carried weight, as if drawn from somewhere deep and untamed. One evening, as she cleaned an old wound on his arm, she asked gently, "What should I call you?" He hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought. Then he spoke, the word low, rough-edged, and foreign. "Kaelric, Kaelric," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "That's different." He pointed at himself again, shorter this time. "Kael, Kael," she said softly. His eyes lifted to hers, something like relief flickering through them, or perhaps recognition. For the first time, she saw a hint of peace in his face. That night, when she wrote the word in the snow outside, Kael, the wolves howled again. The forest answered the name as though it had been waiting for it. Winter deepened, and the forest grew still. The days blurred into a rhythm: gather, teach, rest. Kael learned quickly. He could name the tools, the herbs, even the frost that curled around the windows each dawn. But more than words, he learned her. He learned when her silences meant peace and when they meant fear. He learned the sound of her breath when she dreamed, shallow at first, then calm, like the sea after a storm. And she, too, learned him, the way he moved like shadow across the cabin, silent but certain. The way his presence calmed the air, as though even the fire listened. Sometimes, when she caught him watching her, she felt something stir, not fear, but awareness. It wasn't the gaze of a man, it was the weight of something older, bound by instinct yet softened by mercy. Still, she kept her distance. Safety was fragile, and she had learned too well how quickly it could shatter. The first dream came like a whisper. She stood beneath the blood moon, its light red as flame. Wolves circled her, silent and waiting. At the center, a black wolf watched, eyes gold, unblinking. When she reached out, the world burned. She woke with a gasp, the mark of heat still tingling on her throat. The fire had long gone out, but the air shimmered faintly, as if touched by unseen light. Kael slept on the floor nearby, unmoving but restless, his hands clenched, breath shallow. A faint glow pulsed beneath his skin, vanishing as she blinked. She whispered his name, but he didn't stir. Only the wind answered, carrying the scent of pine and snow and something else, something that felt like promise or warning. Morning came pale and brittle. Frost rimmed the windows, the forest wrapped in white silence. Rowena went to fetch water from the stream, the cold biting her fingers. When she returned, Kael was awake, standing by the hearth, his eyes distant, watching her, or perhaps something beyond her. She set the pail down and felt it then, a sting, light but sharp, at the base of her throat. When she touched it, her fingers met warmth instead of skin. A faint burn, shaped like a crescent moon. Her breath caught. The world seemed to still, the air heavy with meaning she couldn't yet name. Kael's gaze flickered to the mark, and in his golden eyes she saw both awe and fear, as if the forest itself had chosen for them. The fire between them no longer looked like survival. It looked like fate waiting to be named. The next morning, she found a mark on her throat, a faint burn shaped like a crescent moon. The morning light broke through the frost like a blade of glass. Every sound was muted, the world wrapped in the hush that follows a storm. Rowena sat by the dying hearth, a hand pressed to her throat where the faint crescent mark still lingered. It hadn't faded overnight. If anything, it had deepened, a pale glow beneath her skin that pulsed with her heartbeat. Kael watched her from the far side of the room. He hadn't spoken since dawn, but silence clung to him differently today, not peaceful, but heavy. When she finally met his gaze, the air between them shifted. "What did you do to me?" Her voice was soft, yet it carried the tremor of truth she feared to hear. Kael's expression flickered, guilt, sorrow, and something older than both. He turned toward the window, where the pale sun bled across the trees. "I did nothing," he said, his voice rough. "The moon did." She frowned. "What does that even mean?" He hesitated, then stepped closer. His words came slow, deliberate, as though each one cost him breath. You carry the mark of the blood moon, and so do I. He sat near the fire then, the flames reflecting gold in his eyes. It was the first time he had spoken so freely since she'd found him half dead in the snow. My name, he began quietly, as Kaelric, son of Arindor, heir to the Moonblade throne. My father was once king of our kind, but power made him a beast long before the curse did. Rowena listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He sought to rule both realms, the blood of man and wolf. To bind the two races under one crown. When my mother refused his war, he branded as traitors. Kael's voice lowered to a whisper. She was the true queen, and I, the hunted prince. The fire cracked softly between them. Rowena spoke after a long silence. Your father, the king I escaped. Kael nodded once, his jaw tightening. The same. It was as if the forest itself inhaled at his words, a breath drawn from the roots to the sky. Fate, she realized, had not led her to safety. It had led her back into the storm. Outside, dusk crept across the ridges, painting the snow in shades of silver and ash. Kael's voice grew distant, as though he spoke from a place far beyond the walls of the cabin. Our kind are born beneath the blood moon, he said. It blesses and binds us the gift of shifting, the curse of hunger. We are never whole until the moon chooses another soul to mirror our own. He looked up then, and Rowena saw the glow ignite faintly behind his eyes. When that bond awakens, it marks us both. The sign you bear is not wound nor spell. It is recognition, one soul calling another home. Rowena's pulse quickened. And you're saying this? She touched her throat again, trembling, means I'm yours. Kael shook his head sharply. Not mine. Fated. He met her gaze. There's a difference. But the way he said it, quiet, reverent, aching, made her chest tighten. For a long time, neither spoke. The fire burned low, and frost claimed the corners of the windows. Rowena turned from him, voice trembling but defiant. I will not be claimed again. Not by crown, not by curse, not by fate. Kael's silence lingered, heavy as falling snow. Then he said softly, you think I chose this? You think I wanted to mark you? She faced him, anger and fear warring in her breath. Then unmark me, his jaw clenched. If I could, I would. The truth hung there, raw and unyielding. He rose then, pacing near the window where moonlight began to gather. When the moon binds, it doesn't ask. It simply is you saved me, Rowena. That act woke something older than either of us. She stared at the mark again, faint light glimmering beneath her skin. It pulsed once, in time with his heartbeat. She felt it, the echo between them, invisible but alive. Her voice softened. And if I refuse it? Kael turned, his eyes shadowed by something like sorrow. Then the forest will not let you go. Night deepened. Outside, wolves prowled the ridges, their cries echoing through the frost like prayer. Inside, the cabin was thick with silence, a silence that seemed to listen. Rowena sat near the fire, clutching her shawl as warmth and confusion fought within her. The mark on her throat burned gently, like a heartbeat beneath the skin. Each time Kael moved, the glow stirred. When he stepped closer, it flared. When he turned away, it cooled. It was as if her body recognized a truth her mind could not accept. She rose abruptly. I can't stay here. Kael didn't stop her. He only said, "Then go." But his voice carried no challenge, only quiet resignation, like the forest before a storm. She gathered her cloak, stepped into the freezing air, and began to walk. The woods swallowed her quickly, tall pines closing like sentinels. Snow muffled her steps, and the wind whispered through the branches. Every direction looked the same, every shadow stretched too long. She walked faster, heart pounding. The mark throbbed faintly, a pull against her will. She ignored it, pressing deeper into the night. But the forest had changed. The paths she thought she knew bent in strange ways, turning her around until the same fallen tree appeared again and again. Her breath quickened. No, she ran, branches clawing, frost biting at her skin. The mark on her throat burned hotter, guiding her in circles, back and back again. At last, through the veil of snow, she saw it, a single figure standing where the trees thinned, half shadow, half moonlight. Kael. He hadn't followed her. He'd simply been waiting, as if the forest itself had placed him there. Her voice broke through the still air. "Why can't I leave?" His answer came softly, carried on the breath of the wind. "Because fate already knows your path." Rowena stood at the edge of the clearing, her chest heaving, the crescent mark glowing faintly beneath the moon. Around them, the wolves appeared once more, silent, unmoving, eyes gleaming gold between the trees. Kael stepped forward, not as a king or beast, but as something caught between both. "The blood moon binds us," he said. "Not to rule, not to chain, but to remind us what mercy costs." She met his gaze, fear and defiance melting into something unspoken, understanding. The forest hushed, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, the pulse between them beat once, twice. Then steadied, one rhythm shared between two hearts. Rowena whispered, "This isn't over." Kael's eyes gleamed beneath the pale light. "No," he said, "it's only beginning." When she tried to run from him, the forest itself turned her back toward his waiting shadow. The night hung heavy with the scent of rain and blood. Rowena's trembling hands pressed against Kael's torn flesh, the dark crimson seeping between her fingers. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes, those wild, gold-tinged eyes, never wavered from hers. Each breath he took was a growl between life and loss. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice breaking through the forest silence. She tore a strip from her cloak, binding the wound with more desperation than skill. Every heartbeat seemed to echo against the dripping leaves, the rhythm of two souls trying not to unravel. Kael's hand caught her wrist, not to stop her, but to steady her. "You're shaking," he murmured. His voice was low, gravelly, the sound of strength on the edge of exhaustion. "You're bleeding," she countered, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. He smiled faintly. "Then we're both alive." She looked at him, searching his face for something, answers, perhaps, or safety. But what she saw instead was fire. Not the dangerous kind that burns forests, but the one that warms what's cold inside. That night, under the whispering pines and the flicker of dying embers, they shared more silence than words. The world outside was hunting them, but here, in this fragile pocket of time, they existed as something raw and real. When Kael finally slept, Rowena sat awake beside him, tracing the faint scars across his back. They told stories she had yet to hear, and she wondered if she ever would. The forest seemed to breathe with them, a living witness to their unspoken bond. By morning, Kael was already on his feet, the wound wrapped tightly and his resolve stronger than any pain. The wild was his element, untamed, unpredictable, and now, Rowena was part of it. "Listen," he said, crouching beside a set of tracks in the damp soil. "The wind speaks before the forest moves. If you listen closely, it'll tell you what's coming." She crouched beside him, frowning slightly. "I don't hear anything." "Because you're listening with fear," he said, glancing at her with quiet amusement. "The wild doesn't respond to fear, it tests it." He moved like shadow and instinct combined. She followed his lead, her breath shallow as they crossed through ferns and tangled roots. He taught her how to read the language of broken twigs, how to scent rain in the air before the first drop fell. Hours passed, but she barely noticed. Every movement, every quiet instruction from him, felt like learning a forgotten rhythm she had always known. When he guided her hand to a hidden snare trap, her pulse quickened, not just from surprise, but from the way his touch steadied her. "You'll survive out here," he murmured. "Not because I protect you, but because you'll learn to protect yourself." There was pride in his tone, but also something softer, something she wasn't ready to name. That evening, as they sat by the firelight, Kael's gaze lingered on her longer than usual. "Rowena," he said quietly, "you trust me." She hesitated. "I want to." "That's not what I asked." Her chest tightened. "Then yes," she whispered finally. "I do." He looked away, as if her words carried more weight than she could understand. Later that night, the wind changed. The fire snapped as if startled. Kael stood abruptly, every sense alert. "They're coming." Rowena's heart pounded. "Who?" "The royal hunters," he said. "They can track my kind through scent alone." Before she could respond, he turned to her, the amber in his eyes burning bright. "If they find you with me, they'll kill you too." She reached for his arm. "Then run with me." He caught her hand, shaking his head. "You don't understand. If they corner us, I'll lose control, and if I mark you fully." His voice faltered. "Your soul will be bound to mine. Forever." Her breath hitched. The weight of that truth pressed down between them like thunder before the storm. "What does that mean?" she asked softly. "It means you'll never be free of me, not in life, not in death." For a moment, silence ruled. Only the fire crackled between them, painting his face in flickering gold. Then she whispered, "Maybe freedom isn't what I want." His gaze darkened with conflict. "You don't know what you're saying." "Then show me," she said. "Show me what it means." He stepped back, fists clenched, fighting the pull between instinct and restraint. The fire's glow made the markings on his skin shimmer like molten iron. Finally, he turned away, growling under his breath. "Not tonight." But before she could speak again, the distant sound of horns shattered the moment. Kael's head snapped up. "They've found us." He moved fast, grabbing his weapon, his movements sharp and precise. "Stay hidden," he ordered. "Whatever you hear, don't come out." Rowena's throat tightened as he disappeared into the trees, his silhouette swallowed by snow and smoke. The howls of pursuit rose in the distance, blending with the clash of steel and the roar of beasts. The forest was no longer silent. It screamed. Rowena waited, crouched behind the thick trunk of an oak, her heart echoing with every distant growl. The storm had begun. Metal, blood, and fury. Then, silence again. Kael, she whispered. No answer. She rose slowly, stepping through the snow. The trail was easy to follow, prints deep and erratic, smudged with red. The air stung her lungs as she moved faster, calling his name again and again. When she reached the clearing, she stopped. Kael lay motionless in the snow, his hand clutching the hilt of a hunter's blade buried deep in his side. The metal gleamed faintly under the moonlight, dripping with a greenish poison that hissed as it touched the ground. Her knees gave out. No. He opened his eyes briefly, their gold dimming. Run, he rasped. But she didn't move. The night swallowed her cry as the firelight from the burning forest flickered across his still form. The wind whispered through the trees, like a farewell. And the world went silent once more. Snow fell without mercy, soft and relentless, blanketing the forest in silence. Rowena knelt beside Kael's body, her breath coming in shallow bursts that clouded the frozen air. His pulse was faint, his skin cold beneath her trembling fingers. The blade that had cut him still hissed in the snow, its poison darkening the ground like spilled ink. Don't you dare leave me, she whispered, pressing her palm against his chest. His heart gave no answer. Panic clawed at her throat. She had seen wounds before, but never this, never the slow unraveling of something larger than life. Kael had always seemed indestructible, the storm that others feared. Yet here he lay, fragile as breath, undone by a single drop of wolfsbane. She tore at her satchel, spilling herbs, dried petals, and scraps of parchment onto the snow. Think, Rowena, she muttered. Think. The words from her old herbal texts came back to her, fragments half remembered from candlelit nights in the palace library. Blood moss for fever, winter root to draw out venom. But those were miles away, buried in the frozen woods. A sob escaped her, but she caught it quickly, choking it down. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. You taught me to fight, she said, her voice breaking. Now it's my turn. She pressed her forehead against his, feeling the faint echo of warmth still left within him. Then she rose, determination hardening her features. The storm howled like a beast, but she faced it head-on. Kael had once called her fragile. Tonight, the wild would learn otherwise. The blizzard bit at her skin as she ran. Branches clawed her cloak, wind roared in her ears, and the world blurred to shades of white and shadow. Somewhere behind her, Kael lay dying, and ahead, the forest whispered of salvation. Blood moss thrived where warmth met decay, she remembered that from her studies. Near fallen logs, beneath the snow, where life still fought to exist. Her fingers dug into the frozen ground until they bled, clawing through frost and dirt until she found the faint shimmer of crimson threads beneath the bark. She gathered it carefully, wrapping it in cloth, whispering an old healing prayer her mother once sang. Her breath fogged with exhaustion, but she pressed on. Then came the wolves. They appeared between the trees, a circle of gray and silver, eyes gleaming like shards of moonlight. Her body tensed, expecting attack, but instead they stood still, watching her. The largest among them stepped forward and turned its head as if motioning her to follow. She hesitated, until the wind shifted, carrying Kael's fading scent. Without another thought, she followed. Through snow-laden paths and hidden glades, the wolves led her. One paused beside a cluster of frost-tipped roots, winter root. She knelt, tears freezing on her lashes. Thank you, she whispered to the silent guides. The journey back felt endless. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed, but her hands never let go of the herbs. The wolves disappeared as quietly as they had come, their tracks swallowed by snow. When she stumbled back into the clearing, Kael's face was paler than moonlight. His lips were blue, and his chest barely moved. "No, no, no," she murmured, dropping to her knees. She crushed the herbs with numb fingers, mixing them with melted snow and the faint heat of the dying fire. Her hands trembled as she pressed the mixture to his wound, praying, pleading, whispering his name over and over like a vow. "Come back to me," she breathed. "You're not finished. Not yet." Hours passed, though they felt like lifetimes. The fire burned low, casting ghostly shadows across Kael's still form. Rowena's voice grew hoarse from whispering incantations she half remembered, from calling to him through the darkness. "Fight it," she begged. "Please." Her hands pressed against his chest, feeling for any spark of life. Nothing. Only cold. She gritted her teeth, anger replacing despair. "You said you don't die easily," she hissed. "Prove it." Her fist struck his chest, once, twice, 3 times, each blow fueled by fury and heartbreak. "Don't leave me like this." The 4th strike stopped her breath, because his chest rose beneath her palm. A gasp tore through the air, raw and desperate, as Kael convulsed, his body arching with the return of breath. "Kael!" she cried, catching his shoulders as his eyes flew open. But what looked back at her was different. The gold in his gaze had deepened, no longer warm amber but burning, molten fire. His breathing was ragged, his pulse fierce beneath her touch. She leaned back, stunned. You're alive." He blinked, as though learning to see again. The snow fell softly around them, catching on his lashes. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rasp of both pain and wonder. "Rowena." Her name, the first word he spoke. Relief broke through her in waves, tears spilling freely now. She didn't care if he saw. She didn't care about anything but the fact that he was breathing again. He tried to sit, but she stopped him gently. "Don't move," she said. "The poison, it's gone," he whispered, his hand finding hers. "I can feel it," and though she didn't understand how, she believed him. Something had changed. In him, in her, in the bond that had defied death itself. The storm eased by dawn, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. Smoke curled lazily from the remnants of the fire. Kael rested, though uneasily, his strength slowly returning. Rowena sat beside him, her eyes tracing the faint patterns forming on his skin. Faint, glowing lines that pulsed beneath the surface like veins of gold. "What's happening to you?" she whispered. He opened his eyes, the golden fire within them steady now. "The wolfsbane didn't kill me," he said slowly. "It awakened something older, something bound to my bloodline." "The wolfbane king," she murmured, recalling a legend from the old scrolls, of a beast cursed to rule both the living and the damned. Kael nodded faintly. "It's more than a curse now, it's a calling." His gaze lifted to hers. "And I won't face it alone." The promise in his voice sent a tremor through her chest. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, painting the snow in hues of gold, the same gold that glowed faintly within him. The hunt had ended. But a new reign, and a darker destiny, had just begun. As the dawn deepened, the forest seemed to bow in silence. Rowena brushed a hand over Kael's brow, her voice soft. Rest now. But his eyes snapped open, the gold burning brighter than before. He sat up suddenly, eyes fixed on something unseen. What is it? She asked. His gaze turned toward the horizon, where faint, distant horns echoed once again. They know, he said grimly. The Wolfbane King lives. Before she could answer, he rose to his feet, strength returning as if the forest itself obeyed his will. Rowena watched, torn between awe and fear. For the first time, she understood. Kael was no longer just part of the pack. He was becoming the legend they all feared. And she was already bound to him by fate. The storm had not yet lifted. Snow fell in thick, voiceless sheets, burying the world in white silence. Inside the small cabin, the hearth crackled low, a faint glow against the shadowed corners. Rowena knelt beside Kael's still body, her hands trembling as she pressed against his chest. The herbs she had crushed, the blood moss and winter root, lay scattered across the wooden floor, evidence of her defiance against fate itself. Then, beneath her palms, something stirred. A faint pulse, a breath that did not belong to the silence. Kael's chest rose once, twice. Then, with a sudden gasp that tore through the hush like a breaking wave, his golden eyes opened. Only this time, they burned deeper, like sunlight beneath the surface of a lake, steady and endless. Rowena, he whispered, her name carrying through the room like the echo of a vow. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed her forehead to his, a silent thank you to the unseen powers that had spared him. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind the hush of peace after chaos. But in that quiet, both of them understood, something had changed. Kael healed quickly. Too quickly. Within days, the wound that had once bled silver now shimmered faintly beneath new skin, a symbol of what refused to die. Rowena watched from across the room as he tested his strength, his movements fluid yet cautious. The firelight caught the lines of his face, making him look more spirit than man. You should rest, she said softly, folding a piece of cloth near the fire. Kael turned to her, his expression unreadable. I have rested too long. The way he said it, like a truth carried through centuries, made her heart twist. There was something eternal about him now, something untamed and sorrowful all at once. When he stepped closer, the air seemed to shift, warmer, alive. You risked everything for me, he said, voice low. I couldn't let you die, she murmured. Not after everything we've survived. He studied her face, his gaze tracing the faint burn at her throat, the crescent-shaped mark that pulsed softly beneath her skin. For nights, she had tried not to think about it, but it throbbed with each heartbeat, whispering a truth she wasn't ready to face. You bear my mark, he said quietly. Do you feel it? Rowena hesitated. Sometimes. It burns. Sometimes it hums. I don't understand it. Kael's eyes darkened, sorrow flickering through them. It binds what words cannot. The blood moon's curse. It chooses for us, not by command, but by recognition. Recognition. Not control. Not ownership. Rowena drew a breath, grounding herself. And if I don't accept it, then it will fade, he replied, though his tone carried the ache of a lie. But the bond will remain, sleeping, until one day, it wakes. The fire snapped between them, throwing sparks that briefly illuminated their faces, two souls caught between fear and fate. The days that followed were quiet, but filled with a new kind of tension, not fear, but awareness. Kael spoke more now, his once broken words forming clearer sentences. Rowena found herself smiling at his determination, even when his tone remained solemn. She taught him to name things: sky, bread, river, peace, each word a step toward understanding, not only of language, but of one another. In turn, Kael taught her the wild's unspoken code: how to listen for danger in the shifting wind, how to see trails invisible to human sight, how to stand still enough to hear the heartbeat of the forest itself. Sometimes, they spoke. Sometimes, silence said everything. And in those silences, something fragile began to grow. One evening, as twilight sank into frost, Kael placed a hand over her heart, not to claim, but to promise. "Your courage," he said slowly, "it calls louder than fear." Rowena's throat tightened. "And your silence," she whispered, "speaks louder than words." They stood like that, two figures framed by fading light, teacher and student, guardian and survivor, learning to breathe the same rhythm. That night, the sky burned crimson. The blood moon, vast and ancient, rose over the northern peaks, painting the snow in shades of fire and wine. The wolves howled in the distance, their voices a mournful hymn carried by the wind. Rowena stood by the cabin window, watching the world transform beneath the scarlet glow. The mark on her throat pulsed in time with the moon's rhythm, as though it remembered a song she had never learned. Kael joined her quietly. His reflection shimmered beside hers in the frosted glass, half man, half something older. "The moon calls," he said, almost reverently. "It tests what is bound, and what is broken." Rowena turned to him. "And what does it want from us?" "Truth," he answered. "No more running." The air between them thickened, not with fear, but with clarity. For the first time since the night she had fled the royal court, she understood. She wasn't running from a man or a kingdom. She was running from destiny itself. But destiny had found her anyway. The mark burned brighter, and suddenly she could hear it, not his voice in her ears, but inside her mind. A whisper that was both hers and not hers. "Rowena." Her breath caught. "Did you?" Kael nodded once. "The bond has awakened." For a heartbeat, silence held them. Then Rowena closed her eyes. She did not resist. She let the warmth spread through her chest, not consuming but connecting, like a flame shared rather than stolen. They did not speak for a long while. Instead, the connection deepened wordlessly, a merging of trust and understanding that transcended language. She saw flashes of his memories. A boy standing in a field of moonlit grass, a mother's voice carried by wind, a kingdom lost to ambition. And through it all, the same loneliness that had once driven her into exile. Kael felt her pain too, the years of being bartered, silenced, forced to wear obedience like a crown. Neither pitied the other. They simply saw. When she opened her eyes again, the mark at her throat glowed like silver fire. Kael's gaze softened, reverent and almost sorrowful. "The bond is not chains," he said. "It is choice, made by two hearts that finally stopped running." Rowena exhaled, a single tear tracing her cheek. "Then I choose." Outside, the wolves' howls rose as though echoing her words, the forest itself bearing witness to a promise older than language. A wind swept through the trees, scattering the clouds. The blood moon shone brighter, and for the first time, it did not feel like a curse. The next morning dawned pale and quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Kael moved with renewed strength, the sickness gone, the shadows under his eyes replaced by a calm determination. Rowena brewed tea by the fire, the scent of herbs and wood smoke mingling in the cold air. She caught herself watching him, the way he moved, deliberate and graceful, every step echoing the rhythm of something greater than himself. "You're different," she said. "So are you," he replied. His lips curved slightly. "The forest knows." Before she could ask what he meant, the ground trembled. A low, distant rumble, followed by the unmistakable chorus of howls. Dozens, hundreds. Rowena's heart leapt. She rushed to the window. Shadows moved among the trees, dark and swift. A sea of golden eyes glimmered in the morning mist. "They've come," she whispered. Kael stepped beside her, his gaze steady. "Yes." She turned to him, fear threading through her voice. "For you, for us," he said softly. The howls grew louder, surrounding the cabin in a circle of living flame and breath. The wolves did not advance. They waited, silent, as though awaiting a command that had already been given. Kael's voice lowered to a whisper that carried the weight of centuries. "They've come for their king, and for my mate." The cabin door creaked as a gust of wind swept through. Rowena met his eyes, gold meeting earth, and knew that her world had changed forever. She had sought refuge in the wilderness, but the wilderness had chosen her instead. Outside, the first wolf stepped forward and bowed. The forest held its breath. And somewhere beyond the mountains, the dawn began to rise, heralding not peace, but a beginning. The first light of dawn found the snow-strewn valley hushed under a pale sky. The storm that had once screamed around the cabin had died in reverence, as though the wind itself awaited what would come next. Rowena stood by the threshold, Kael at her side, his breath steady now, no longer burdened by poison, but laced with quiet strength. The mark at her throat shimmered faintly, pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. From beyond the frost-covered trees came the sound of many feet, not marching, but moving with purpose. Shadows gathered between the birches, and one by one, the shapes of wolves emerged from the forest's edge. Their eyes gleamed like liquid gold beneath the rising sun. They came not with growls, but with a silence that spoke of allegiance. Among them walked figures cloaked in fur and moonlight, men and women with eyes too bright for mortals, moving in a formation of reverence. At their center strode an elder woman, tall and graceful, her presence as commanding as the storm itself. Her silver hair caught the sunlight like spun frost, and her gaze, sharp and knowing, settled on Kael. "Son of the lost queen of Moonglade," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "The blood of kings runs in you. The clans have felt your return." Kael's shoulders straightened as though a forgotten weight had been lifted. Memories that were not his own flickered in the gold of his eyes, fragments of a mother's voice, the cry of wolves beneath twin moons, the fall of a kingdom swallowed by its own hunger for power. "I was no one," he murmured, the disbelief fragile yet sincere. The elder woman's expression softened. "You were hidden, not lost. Your mother placed her hope in the bloodline, knowing one day the bond of love would awaken the king within." Rowena watched in silence, her heart thundering. She could feel his energy shift beside her, not the wild rage of the beast she once feared, but the calm authority of a leader accepting his destiny. The wolves around them bowed low, their chests touching the earth in reverence. Then the elder turned to Rowena. "And you," she said, eyes alight with something ancient. The Luna who walked through snow and shadow. The Mark chose you, not by his will, but by fate's own design. Rowena's breath caught. I'm human, she whispered, uncertain. Human, the elder replied, smiling faintly, and more. You bridged two worlds by faith alone. You are not claimed, you are chosen. As dawn fully broke, the valley seemed to come alive. The wolves lifted their heads to the light, their howls blending into a song that trembled through the air, not of mourning, but of renewal. The elder stepped forward, placing a hand upon Kael's brow. Kael of Moonblade, by the call of the blood moon and the will of the pack, you are named Alpha King, guardian of the ancient bond, restorer of the balance between man and wolf. A low hum filled the air. Light rippled through the mark on Rowena's throat, spreading to the pendant she wore, then outward to Kael. It was as though the world itself acknowledged their union, nature's seal on something far older than either of them could comprehend. The wolves encircled them, each bowing their heads. Even the wind seemed to kneel. Kael reached for Rowena's hand. His gaze met hers, steady, unyielding, alive. You walked into a storm to save me, he said softly. Now stand with me to rebuild what the storm destroyed. She nodded, her eyes shining with quiet fire. Together, before the gathered clans, Kael and Rowena stood shoulder to shoulder. He lifted his voice, strong and sure, let the rule of fear end here. Let no blood be taken for power, but given for peace. Let man and wolf remember they were once brothers of the same moon. The elder nodded, her eyes glistening. So it shall be. The mark on Rowena's neck flared once more, not as a brand, but as a crown of light. The wolves began to howl again, this time with a reverence that sent shivers through the mountain air. Kael turned to her and took her hand, pressing it to his lips, not as a gesture of dominance, but of devotion. His voice was low, carrying the weight of promise and destiny intertwined. No cage can hold what is fated, he murmured. And as the words left his lips, the light of dawn crowned them both, the Alpha King and his Luna, no longer hunted, but heralded. The cabin that once stood as a shelter of survival now watched over a kingdom reborn. Snow melted into rivers of silver light, and in their reflection, two figures stood where fear once ruled, bound not by chains, but by choice. She thought the cabin would keep her safe, but fate built her a kingdom instead.